Thank you for joining us for another episode of Team Lift Presents Rodical Thinking.
All right, what's up, everybody? It's your boy, Roderick McDaniel, and thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Rodical Thinking, the show where we believe everyone has an amazing story if you shut up long enough and let them tell it. And I do believe we got another amazing story coming in for you today. This one is going to be a lot of fun for me. I always love the shows where it's people that I love and I know, so these are always great shows for me. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Before I bring him on, I want to let you know, this guy is, in my personal words, hella interesting. All right, and we kind of met each other in the performance. I'll say we were both performers. He was definitely on a better level than I was, higher level than I was. It's hard to describe this guy. Master of Ceremonies at the Pickle Punk Sideshow. Used to be a Master of Ceremonies. I want to say, I might get it wrong, and if I do, forgive me, it's my memory, but it was Bomb City
Pretties.
Yes, Bomb City Pretties Burlesque.
Yes, sir.
All right, and then got some pretty cool things he's done in his life. It's some pretty amazing things and great travel stories. But man, this guy. Without further ado, I bring you Mr. Drew Blood. How you doing, brother?
What's up, Roderick? How you doing?
Man, I'm doing great. Doing great. Man, thanks for coming on the show. Especially with today, what we're going to talk about. And just a fascinating story that you've told me before. And I think a lot of times our listeners don't know some of the crazy things that I did before I started doing podcasts. But one of the things that you and I had talked about for the longest time is I wanted to shoot a documentary. And I was working with, I want to say Make Way Media at the time, kind of was like willing to work with me and shoot whatever I wanted to shoot. And I wanted to do a documentary about atheism in America, but I wanted to do it differently. You know, I think a lot of times people make documentaries and they try to make them where it's like, oh, let me bash this group of people and make them look bad. And I always wanted to do something that's like, I just want to know when was it you knew? And just hear those stories. And I always thought that was a much more fascinating story than to pick apart somebody's life or say this is wrong or that's wrong. I just want to hear your story. And when we started Rodical Thinking and it started growing, it came back to me. It's like, this would be a great way to do this. And one of the first people I thought about, because I feel like you have the most fascinating story I've ever had personally to hear, was you. And I wanted you to be the first guest that came on when we did this. So truly can't thank you enough for just taking out of your day to share some time with us and tell us your story, brother.
Well, dude, I think that you've been really amazing at having a point of view, but never trying to sell that point of view and always being interested in hearing what others have to say. So I think you're the perfect guy to do this kind of show. Oh, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's get into this. It's a crazy thing, and I was doing research about it leading up to it because I started kind of wondering, I have a lot of friends that are, especially since I've, since 2014, the number seems to be growing, of friends who were Christian, identified as Christian or grew up in Christian households who now are, I'd say irreligious, I guess is the word, or have totally, just said, yeah, I'm walking away from it. Either they're agnostic or they're atheists or they don't identify with any religious doctrine. Mm-hmm. And I just found that amazing. And one of the things I kept saying was, how? And that's what I want, tell me how it started for you, really. Let's just do that.
How it started moving away from religion, or how my religious journey started?
Let's hear about how it started. I mean, because you grew up in the Christian household, I take it.
All right. Yeah. So my family was Assembly of God, or various forms of very, very Pentecostal kind of speaking in tongues was a real thing in my family. Dancing in the aisles, that kind of thing. Church going people that it was our life. Our life was centered around what church services we were going to that week, multiple services, sometimes on Sundays and Wednesdays, pretty intense. That's what we lived. And that lasted for me until I was 17, 18 is when things started to get less sure. During that time, I remember having there's an argument I remember having with my sister when I was probably, we were kids. I was probably second grade and she was first grade, something like that, about whether it was better to go to Sunday school or the adult service, because she tried to sell it. She was younger than me, that they had snacks, and I countered back that we had snacks in the adult services because we took communion. So we had fights about, what level of religion was better than another all the way back then. I got really into Bible quizzing when I was in my probably middle school or so. We did it was like Quiz Bowl pretty much, where we would memorize entire books of the Bible to quiz over, and I was state champion when I was about 16 or so. Like it was all I did. I studied the Bible harder than I studied my schoolwork, and my social life was based around youth group. All my friends were the people that I went to church with. And when that changed, and this is, I think, where we started kind of talking about it, is, it was complete devastation. My life, it was the hardest thing that I ever went through, was losing that faith. And I'm very interested now in the process of the loss of faith and the gaining of faith from people who have never had it. That whole process of changing how you look at existence on that deep level is fascinating to me, because it was such a completely revolutionary kind of process to go through. As far as how it happened, how that change happened, my sister was kind of the problem child between the two of us. She was 19 months younger than me. And when I look back now on why she was the problem child, honestly, a lot of it was pretty normal teenage stuff. But because of, I kind of hesitate to use the word indoctrination. I still respect my parents. I know they were trying their best to give us a good upbringing, but we were heavily indoctrinated in the church. My sister was mostly a pretty normal teenager going through some tough times. But I do look back, she'd been diagnosed around 12, 13 with bipolar. They question now if maybe she was schizophrenic. She was into, at the time, it was like Nirvana and the Beastie Boys, pretty mainstream, 9 Inch Nails, pretty mainstream rock bands, that kind of thing. But she was experimenting with drugs when she was in her early teens, and things that were just like very anathema to me, because I was the good kid and I always had to prove that I was, having a solid walk with the Lord or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I rejected the things that she was going through. And so during that time period where I was kind of distancing myself from her, she ended up getting pregnant. She was 15. And to kind of get me away from, I think, that conflict in the family, my parents said that they felt like I was moving away from my walk and that I should go on a missionary trip. This is between my junior and senior year of high school. So they let me pick where I was going to go. And I went to Australia for my summer break in between junior and senior year. And during that time, I kind of felt very led by the Lord to sort of follow. I think now looking back, it was kind of a selfish process, but I felt led to distance myself from the conflicts we were having at home, to move forward with my academic goals, which at the time I was being offered scholarships to go to religious colleges and things. And so during this time where I was feeling like I was having callings from God, I would have very, very rare phone calls back home. My family lived in Minnesota at the time. I was in Australia. It was very expensive to make those calls, so it was like a couple of times. And one call I would get would be that they were in Texas for some reason, and the car broke down, and so they were buying a new car. And then the next call, I'd find out, oh, they just got curious, so they started looking at houses while they were in Texas buying cars. And so I was like, okay, cool. This is kind of fitting with this plan that I have to like get separated. And then I would get a call saying that I got accepted to the University of Minnesota for my senior year of high school. They had a post-secondary option where you could go to college while you were still in high school. And so little by little, this story was kind of working out in my brain where my family was moving away and I was going to stay behind to go to school. And it felt very, very solid. It felt like a story I was being told by God. Mm-hmm. So when this trip finally came to an end, and like during that time, all I did was manual labor. We were doing concrete work on a Bible school in Sydney, or outside of Sydney. And then on multiple days a week, we were giving testimonies in local churches kind of to support ourselves while we were doing this. And then every day was Bible study multiple times a day. And it was this heightened religious experience, more than I'd ever had before. And so they call it a mountaintop experience. You come back from a missionary trip, and like all you think about is God for months and months and months. And then you have to come back to the real world and live your real life, and everything seems strange and foreign. So I got back, and my parents met me at the airport in Minneapolis, and they said, hey, after all of our tearful greetings and everything on the way back, they said, hey, we have something to talk to you about, but we're going to wait. So we're going to have a family meeting in the morning. And so that was kind of, set a weird anticipatory vibe. And I went to bed and I woke up in the morning and we sat down and talked. And I was very like expectant for like this story in my head to play out. And we sat down and they told me, hey, we looked at a house in Texas. And the story that they had was that it was because my parents were getting older and their arthritis was getting really bad. And they wanted to get out of the humidity of Minnesota. But really, it was all about getting my pregnant sister away from the influences she had in Minnesota. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. Good luck, guys. I look forward to visiting at Christmas time or whatever. And my dad looked at me. It's like, you're 17 years old. You're coming with us. And it really just kind of crashed. Like I fought a little bit on that. I had an interest in a girl for the first time in my life. I was kind of a late bloomer. Mm-hmm. And I had sort of my first real solid set of friendships that I'd ever had in that area because we moved a lot earlier. And so I just, I didn't have a lot I had a lot to leave for the first time kind of. And so I struggled with that, but I was obedient. I had never really gone through a really strong rebellious stage yet. And so for the next 2 weeks, I said my goodbyes. We had our going away parties and things. And especially saying goodbye to a girl that I was interested in, that was starting to be mutual. And she was my best friend in high school. So that was especially kind of a heartbreaking thing for me. And we left from Minnesota, driving to Texas. We had 2 vehicles. My dad stayed behind to sell the house or finish closing on the house. So it was my mom, my sister, and me. They drove 1 vehicle. And since I was old enough to drive, I drove the van. And everything was kind of okay, or like in this, I don't know. I was like in a fugue state, I think, until we hit Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we stopped at a Shoney's to get dinner, and they had a map, along the highway where you could see where you were and the different major cities in the country. And it was a really just strong moment that still sticks with me now, over 20 years later, of seeing where we were and how far we'd come and how close we were to where we were going. And I just fell apart, man. I think I struggled with clinical depression for most of my life, starting in my teens, and I think that was the trigger for it. That's the first time that I ever remember being suicidal. I locked myself in the van with a knife, and never really followed through on much, but I crashed. And I think starting at that point where I had felt very called to a specific thing, I think that's where it all started to crumble for me. It took me years after that to come to terms with what that meant to me long term, and what I really believed at that point. But that was the beginning of the end for me, where I stopped believing in God.
Wow. And I really don't think people understand what it means when Christians go through this, because there were so many things you said that they triggered for me personally, where how it does become a part of your life. It's like a huge part of your life, and you build friendships and family connections, and you build business connections through church. It's ingrained in everything you do, whether you're saying grace before food, saying prayers before you go to sleep, saying prayers when you get up. It is as much a part of your life as breathing and eating. It's there. And then
Absolutely.
And then have it removed, or to have to question it, to question that faith. That is to me, there are certain things that happen in people's lives, like that are psychologically, emotionally, mentally just devastating. I think in a relationship, when there's been infidelity or cheating, devastating. It's like dropping a nuclear bomb on it. I think when you have a strong belief in a system that there is a God and his son Jesus died on the cross, from the time I remember being old enough to understand, so probably 3, maybe 4, I remember hearing that story, and how God delivers, and how God is there, and you don't want to go to hell, and hell is bad, and the devil. I remember those stories very vividly. And even as an adult, I remember those stories. And then to one day say, that's not how it works. None of that's real. That's devastating. That is emotionally devastating. I can see where you would have been that way.
Especially when you came up in a literal view of the Bible. Everything is truth. I've lived a lot of life since then. I've met a lot of people that have come up in a lot of different religious upbringings. And, a lot of people are kind of embracing sort of a half-ish version of religion, where, they believe in God, or they like the idea of sort of a creator God. And all the ritual around it and things like that, but they don't really literally believe that those stories are all true. And I think a lot of people already have some level of questioning built into it, whether it's because they had friends that didn't believe the same thing as them, or, they went to public school and so they were given a decent science education, or, whatever it might be. I went to Christian schools. I didn't have secular friends. I didn't have any of that. So for me, it was absolute truth. And it was really, really a vision of how the world worked and how the universe worked was no longer solid anymore, and that one little crack is all it takes. When so much of your world is based on one kind of worldview, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. Man, that's fascinating. So when it cracks, is it like a trickle, or was it like a floodgate after that?
Well, I fought back for a long time. I think I was sticking my fingers in the holes and trying to stop that trickle for a long time. I think so. That happened when I was 17. So that would have been like, 1996. And for a couple of years, I just sort of tried to, I viewed myself as, I guess, a struggling Christian. I did a lot of the fighting with God in my head. Meanwhile, I was extremely depressed. So, I was kind of begging for help and doing that sort of crying out to God thing.
Oh, we all had those Job moments, brother. I get that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then I never really found any kind of resolution during all that. And so it kind of went downhill for a while. I did move to Texas with my family, and I crashed out. I was just so depressed. And I got my first personal computer at that time, and I spent all my time locked in my room talking to this girl in Minnesota that I was missing. And I started skipping out on. I was a good student before this, A student, and I started skipping out on school for the first time. I started a new school my senior year in a very different environment. It was going from a class of 80 people in rural Minnesota to 300 something Amarillo High. And so I there was opportunities that were there that I'd never had before as far as what kind of classes I could take and stuff, but I just didn't care. And I started hanging out with the dirts, the stoner kids and whatever that I had never had a part of before, really. And I started skipping school, and I would go to there's a theater there that you'd go to 2 movies for $1 or something. And so I'd just do that so I didn't have to be around my family. And saw Jackie Brown that way. Still remember that. But yeah, so eventually it got so bad that my parents just came in my room one day. I remember this conversation pretty clearly, and they're like, "We screwed up. We have a ticket for you to fly back to Minneapolis. We found a place for you to live, and you missed your chance to get into the dorms, but still get there in time to start school, University of Minnesota, get back on track." I respect them a lot for that, but it was too little too late for me. I didn't have any way, and my parents were not rich. So I went back to Minneapolis, 17, lived in a stranger's house. That they were young guys that were involved in a church, and that's how they had found them. So I lived and I just like shut myself in this room, and I didn't have any way to eat or anything. So I just like, I guess it's not that abnormal, but I lived on ramen and nothing else. A lot of times I would be too depressed to take the bus to go to school, and I ended up failing out. So I went back to another school that I had never been to before to graduate, which is the public school in the small town that I was near, who I had gotten I guess like, I suppose it was, they had essentially paid for it through public funding through this public school, whatever. So I graduated from that high school living in my friends' basements. And so it just kind of got into this very like weird, low place for a couple of years where I was just like living where I could and staying with friends and relying on the kindness of strangers and just kind of bombing out because I was so depressed because it doesn't just snap back. And I think after a couple of years of that, working 40 hours a week while I was going to high school and things, I started to think of myself as agnostic for the first time. And even that felt like I was accepting a death sentence. It felt like I was admitting that I was going to go to hell, because I still believed in those things, in a way, because they were so ingrained in me. I knew now that it wasn't honest, at least not to life the way that I thought it had been before. So yeah, over a couple of years, kind of grappled with that idea of agnosticism and kind of came to terms with it. It probably took me until my early 20s to really be able to say I'm agnostic. And so we're talking 5 years, and I'm still not talking about being an atheist. And so, a few years more and talking to more people and understanding kind of the more philosophical and conceptual ideas about agnosticism and atheism. And I was also very involved in the political punk scene, and those are some atheists. Can I swear?
Oh yeah, there's no.
Those are some God-hating motherfuckers. So, I think that that kind of musical propaganda kind of influenced me as well, where I was finally able to start talking about how I really felt. Which, all this, I think, comes down to a sense of betrayal. That's really what I felt at the beginning, and that's kind of where a lot of it came from. I hate to admit that I started out as an angry atheist, because now where I'm at is more of a rational perspective, I guess. But that's where it started, You feel like the world is one way, and then it's not that way, and then you suddenly are able to question a lot of things that you'd never felt open to question before. So that's kind of where it all started to change for me. I'd say my mid-20s is where the word atheist started to come into the lexicon a little bit more.
That is okay. So I got that. It's fascinating, but I guess really my first thing would say when it happened, people come to you and say, "Hey, you should read this," or did they come to you and say, "Oh, you should look into this"?
Well, my parents maybe, but not really, because first of all, I was so distanced from everything that I had come from at that point. I'd moved far away. I guess I left out. Like I went through high school in rural Minnesota. I graduated while I was working full time, and then I went to school in Wisconsin, in college for a little bit, and so I didn't know anybody there. And when that went really bad, I moved to Chicago for a little bit. And I didn't know anybody there, and I ended up having to move back to my parents at that point, and they were still living in West Texas. And so really the only religious influences I had on my life at that point were my parents, who at this point didn't have so much, influence in my life. I kind of rejected that part, especially I think back then I was maybe more angry at them. I'm not anymore, but I didn't have anybody in my life to point me in any other direction, but I knew the Bible really well. And so when I was questioning things, I was digging into the Bible for answers, you know. But I guess there'd been enough of a significant change in the way that I looked at things that I just wasn't able to ever look at things again with the authority that they had before. Nothing felt real to me in the way that they had. And the people that did really have influences in my life point were friends that I made along the way, who kind of came from multiple backgrounds, but at this point I was hanging out with punk rockers. So that was mostly people that had rebelled against their parents and turned their backs on the things that they had come up with. And so, no, I don't really feel like by the time I started getting those things again, it was like so I had a Dead Kennedys t-shirt that I got on eBay when I was 21 or something like that, and I was living in my parents' garage after I moved back to Texas, and it had like lynched Ku Klux Klan members on it, and it showed up in the laundry, and I hadn't thought about it. My dad like left it in my laundry pile with a note on it that said like, "Where are your morals?" or something. Like, this is what you're upset about? Like, I don't like Nazis. So it seemed at that point like their morality was very misplaced, I guess. Like, it didn't really feel like they cared about the things that they should have cared about. And then I could look back at my whole history before that, and all that life of servitude and all that stuff that I've been taught earlier, I could look back on it in the sense of, I guess, like a social justice window now. And like, my parents never got involved in the things where people were really suffering, and so like the things I cared about at that time in my life, politics and social issues, and when I could look back at that and see like, oh, all these people that say they care about things, then it started to be like my worldview was starting to build in another direction. And then I could look back at all the evidence, and have that sort of confirmation bias to build up this new news story that was working itself out.
That's good. That's good stuff. That is and the reason I ask that is because it seems like anytime we, especially if you come into the Christian faith, for years, I've always said part of the problem with the modern church is that it's really good on the show and the glitz, but it doesn't address any of the pains and the hurts, and it doesn't talk about pornography addiction amongst men and their clergy. It doesn't talk about abuse in marriage. It doesn't talk about toxic masculinity. It doesn't talk about homosexuality. It just basically glosses over everything. It just says these things don't exist and we're not going to help. We're supposed to help the poor, but yet we vote for policies because we identify that either way that don't help the poor. But to me, it's always an issue where you're like, you say one thing and then this Bible says one thing, but you're totally always doing something that doesn't line up with those red letter words in this book that I'm reading here.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. And I feel like there's a lot in the Bible that, I can't argue with, and that I would love to be able to look back at. But there's so much conflicting data there as well, that When I started, because this is okay, so at the same time that I'm starting to look at religion from sort of a political and social viewpoint, I'm seeing the way that religion is used in a political and social way.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's weaponized. And I learned the history of like the sort of the religious right and Pat Robertson and sort of all the political ways that religion has been used in the past. At the same time that I'm dealing with all this other stuff. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so easy in the same way that people kind of, what you're saying is people sort of look at these things in the way that backs up their own viewpoints, maybe. It's very easy to twist these things to back up some sort of agenda. And I feel like that started in the 70s, and we see it very, very much in play today. And that's only kind of cemented the way that I feel about things, I guess. It's like, I don't want any part of this, you know?
Oh yeah, no, because it's definitely the part where you start going, man, this is just a toxic environment, and I don't want to be. As one of my friends used to say when I was in the military, he was notorious for always saying, "Hey, not my monkeys, not my circus," and he was out. He didn't want to be. He didn't care what was going on. That wasn't his area where he was going to concern himself. And it's I think a lot of times in the church we get that way. It was easy. I mean, I believe. It's weird that as a stand-up comedian, one of the most controversial things I ever said on a stage that I got the most feedback from was when I said on stage that, I know this is going to sound crazy to some of you guys, but I believe in the whole Jesus God thing. I just don't believe in Christians. I don't believe in these people that are his followers, but I believe in those two guys. And it was almost like half the audience was like, this is the greatest joke anybody has ever told. And the other half was like, he's not getting out of town alive. We can't let that ideology spread. And it was, I could see it. It was like the way the room reacted. There were people who laughed, but then caught themselves laughing because it hit them in a place where they didn't want to be hit. And it's like, yeah, I knew it. That was solid. I knew when I wrote that was solid. But and it's true. I still struggle with it. Like I've been homeless. I've lost. I did the whole thing praying to God when my dad was dying with cancer. I prayed. I don't want him to die, and if you'll heal him. Oh man, I cut deals with God. Oh man, I'm supposed to be a TV evangelist right now because I cut so many deals with God. And when he passed, for me it was just like I was angry. I had a hard time believing in a God. And then I started looking back through and going, cancer has ripped my family a new one. So both grandfathers, great grandfather, mom's breast cancer survivor. I lost my dad, and then you look at me and know I'm probably the unhealthiest one, and so it's like probably not setting my kids up for a good future in the next 20 something years. There's something they're probably going to have to deal with, and it sucked. It just sucked, and so you start going through that thing about, do I honestly believe in this? And I had to question it. And one of my biggest issues I've always had as a kid was when I was 5 and we lived in New Orleans, and I went to a Catholic school, and that meant I had to do mass on Wednesdays, but I went to an AME church on Sundays, and that's an all black church, African, Methodist, Episcopalian, whatever that AME meant. But it was, I went to that church on Sunday, and I remember asking my dad, so who's lying? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, what they said at Mass on Wednesday is not the same thing that they said at church on Sunday. So which one of them's lying? And he wasn't prepared to answer that question. He was not. He said, I never even thought. In fact, I never went to Catholic school another day after that. I was put in public school for that because there's two people telling two different stories. One saying I have to come through this man in order to get salvation, and then another one was telling me that I could have a personal relationship with Jesus and I didn't need to go through anyone. Yet, why do I have to go to confession if I don't have to? If I can just go confess it to Jesus, why am I having to go sit in this box and confess anything?
Thank you for listening to Rodical Thinking, a Team Lift production. Hit us up at GoTeamLift and at Coach Silky on Twitter.